Howdy, today I'm Flipping Science, looking at the transmission of infectious diseases. So the science understanding we're going to look at is describe methods by which pathogens can be transmitted. We're going to look at air, dust, direct contact, feces, food and animals. So transmission of infectious diseases can occur in a variety of ways. What's happening is you're transmitting the infectious agent, so that could be the virus or bacteria or the other ones we've looked at so far. You're transmitting it from a host or a source to another host or source. So if you're infected, you could cough in the air. The droplets could be inhaled by a healthy person and they get infected. Or if we're looking at a source, so that could be, bacteria that's been left on some food, for example. So that would be the source, and that's taken in by the healthy person. So let's look at some ways that diseases are transmitted. So firstly, we're going to look at air and dust. So many pathogens can be transmitted by air. They might not necessarily be floating through the air, but they're usually associated with things like droplets that are produced from one person. Here's a person sneezing. You can see all these droplets coming out, and those droplets are produced when a person just talks or if they cough or they sneeze. And the bacteria can sit on those droplets and they can float around for a long period of time. They can then be inhaled by another person, and that causes that person to get sick when they're taking in the bacteria or viruses or whatever into their system. Similarly, this can occur with dust. So there are a lot of bacteria, for example, associated with dust. If the dust is kicked up, it can float around, and those bacteria sitting on that dust can be inhaled in a similar way. So here's some examples of some infections that can be transmitted by air or dust. It's got influenza, so here we have the influenza virus sitting on the droplets that are being kicked off by a person. Mumps, whooping cough, which is common, it commonly affects babies if they're not immunized or people around them aren't immunized. Pneumonia, and this is the bacterial pneumonia. Tuberculosis and streptococcus, so that's a throat infection. Direct contact is where pathogens are transmitted when one person touches, kisses or has sexual contact with another person. Essentially you're transmitting by touching the other person in one way or another. The transmission occurs when bodily fluids are exchanged between one person and the other, and we can look at this in the examples of classic STIs. So an STI is a sexually transmitted infection. These are some of the diseases that can be transmitted this way. So let's look at some examples of STIs. So here's the HIV virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, and that causes AIDS. Here's a herpes virus. This is a herpes simplex that causes herpes. Down here we can see these little dots here. That's bacteria that are gonorrhea bacteria, so Neisseria gonorrhoeae. That's the bacteria species here that causes gonorrhea. Down here we've got some chlamydia, which is another bacteria. HPV is one that I haven't put in here. It's another virus that causes genital warts and can cause cervical cancer. And pubic lice. So here's a pubic lice down here. So this is an animal pathogen. In many cases, these can be prevented by using safe sex techniques, and they can be treated, well, the bacterial ones can be treated usually with antibiotics. So there are treatments available for some of these diseases, but not all. Many infectious bacteria are transmitted via feces and what we call fecal-oral transmission. What happens is the feces finds its way into water usually, but sometimes food or other places, and then that's taken in by another person. Often in third world countries, the feces makes its way into water, and that water can be used for cleaning or drinking. Also, like I said with food, people not washing hands when they're preparing food can cause fecal-oral transmission. As stated before, it's more common in countries where hygiene and sanitation aren't easily accessed. Down here we've got the F diagram showing how we can get fecal-oral transmission occurring. So feces going into fluids in the person, fields where food is grown, onto food. Flies can transmit because they eat and then they take it away with them, and also on fingers, so on hands. So here's some examples of some infections that can be transmitted through fecal-oral transmission. Here's E. coli. So E. coli is a bacteria that's present in your gut. They can be transmitted from one person to another if they don't wash their hands after you go into the toilet, for example. Here is a dysentery bacterium, so it's from the Shigella species. There's many Shigella species that cause dysentery. Dysentery causes vomiting and diarrhea. In World War I, for example, it killed a lot of people. Over here we've got cholera, so Vibrio cholerae, so that can, again, it's similar to dysentery in a way. It's caused by infection of water supplies. Hepatitis A down here, so we've got the hepatitis virus. That can be transmitted when people don't wash their hands after going to the toilet, and then touching food, for example. Here we have a poor girl in an iron lung because she's got polio. So polio is a bacteria. It produces a toxin that paralyzes muscles. So she can't breathe on her own, so she's in this machine that is breathing for her. Here's rotavirus. Rotavirus causes digestive system distress. Giardia, we talked about before, so Sydney's water supplies had problems with this Giardia a little while ago. So that's a protist. And then tapeworms. So tapeworm eggs can be put into water or onto soil, and then when food grows there, the tapeworm eggs can make their way into people's bodies. Animals can transmit pathogens to humans, and these can be viruses or protists or bacteria. Lots of different ways they can do that. And this is one reason why we have strict quarantine regimens in Australia if you want to bring animals into Australia from other places. This way you can avoid diseases coming into Australia. As it's an island continent, it's been isolated for a very long time, so it doesn't have some diseases present. So by having good quarantine, we can stop those diseases coming in. And the animals can transmit the pathogens via pathways that we previously mentioned. So them coughing or sneezing can produce those droplets that have the bacteria floating around in them. Their feces can carry bacteria, viruses, and so on. So many different species of animals can transmit many different species of infections. So here we've got a bit of a list down here, so we can see the Toxoplasma gondii that we talked about before. It's transmitted from cats. What else have we got? Yersinia pestis, which is plague, and I'll talk about plague in a second. So here are some examples of diseases that are passed on by animals. Mad cow disease, which is called, well, has another name, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. That is transmitted by a prion. We haven't talked about prions. They're proteins, infectious proteins. So not viruses, not bacteria, they're just proteins that change shape. If you ate cows infected with BSE, then those proteins can make their way into the brain. They make these holes. That's where the spongiform comes in. So they make your brain spongy. And encephalopathy is infection of the brain. Rabies is a very famous one. We don't have rabies in Australia, but it is present in other places around the world. So when you get bitten by an animal that's infected with rabies, the virus goes into you and causes all kinds of problems. Inflammation of the brain and death being quite common. Schistosomiasis, I'll get it one day. This is a worm that is transmitted in a very weird way. I'll move that down here. So the human that's infected deposits eggs from their urinal feces. That makes its way through the environment into snails. Those snails give off proto-worms. They go into humans, or they can develop inside other species as well, and then they can make their way into humans as well. They make their way into humans through their feet over here, so if you're not wearing shoes in infected fields, you can get these worms into you. Malaria, about half of all people who've ever lived probably died from mosquito-borne diseases, and the most famous one of those is malaria. So the malarial parasite, the mosquito takes in infected blood from a person. The parasite is in the saliva of the mosquito, so when the mosquito bites the next person, it injects the saliva in there and transmits the infectious agent as well. It's a parasite, it's a protist. And that causes all kinds of problems in the body. Bubonic plague, so about a third of the people in Europe died from bubonic plague. The way it was transmitted is interesting. There were fleas carried on rats. The rats were infected with the bacteria. It's a bacteria, Yersinia pestis. The fleas drinking the rat's blood, they take in that bacteria into them, and then they bite a human, and the human gets infected. So like I said, about a third of the population of Europe was killed by bubonic plague in the 1300s, so it's quite bad. So today on Flipping Science, we looked at transmission methods of pathogens. That's it for Flipping Science today. See ya.